最后，请使用投影片报告的发表人抽空将档案存到报告用电脑进行测试。好，接下来为第7届马来西亚华人研究国际双年会第2场专题演讲。首先为各位介绍本场主持人，马来西亚华社研究中心董事兼学术委员会张运华主任。主讲人为新加坡国立大学中文系兼任教授柯群英教授。现在将时间交给张主任。
Hello, testing. OK， 好，各位早上好。那么还有我们线上的朋友哈，让大家知道一下，我们这个场次呢是线下线上同时进行哈。那非常欢迎大家出席这个第2场的这个主题演讲哈。小弟是马来西亚华社研究中心学术主任张运华，非常荣幸能够主持这一场次的这个主题演讲。那么我其实是在这一次的这个会议呢，才能够见到柯教授的这个庐山真面目哈。但是呢，之前我们在华研呢，常常有提到他的名字也有拜读他的一些著作，所以这是有点可以说是很大的一个收获哈。在座的各位可能很多跟柯老师呢是旧知认识很久了。但是也有一些可能是第一次像我一样第一次见到老师的这个庐山真面貌但是呢，我相信大家都是对柯老师的这个了解是非常深入的因为柯老师在这个圈子里面的这个领域里面呢，也是一个非常让我们值得敬佩的一个学者所以呢，作为一个主持人要介绍柯老师不容易。因为可能分分钟你们比我更了解还是要做一些介绍简单的介绍。柯老师的目前呢，刚才你们可以看到，他目前是在新加坡国立大学的这个中文系担任这个兼任的教授。但是柯老师的他的这个不只是学历他的游历也很丰富他曾经在香港大学也在我看了您的什么资料呢。原来您也在马来西亚莫纳斯大学还有这个澳洲的这个墨尔本大学担任这个老师。当然柯老师也在这个学术的这个社团非常的活跃了我也不一一的介绍。但是呢，我觉得要给大家理解一样东西的，就是说柯老师的这一些经历他在不同国家的经历。其实就塑造了老师的今天这种在这种区域比较的这种学术的这种比较是非常应该是很有影响因为柯老师在地在不同国家可以亲身的去理解去了解当地的一种人文社会那么这也是今天柯老师的这个主题就是祭祖在东南亚华人与中国宇宙里协同文化盆地的形成的一个我觉得一个很重要的一个他的一个经验所酝酿出来的一种成果所以当我们很多在座的各位可能在我们各自的领域有非常好的这个见解，但是可能我们就是缺乏这种所谓的跨区域的这种经验所以我们今天很有幸的可以来像柯老师我很喜欢叫老师，我不喜欢叫教授因为在我的观念里，老师是这种比较尊称那么这样我们就以最热烈的掌声来欢迎我们的柯老师OK， 但是柯老师我还是要提醒您的时间50分钟45分钟我会给你一个提示谢谢。
OK， 首先我要感谢举办单位就是华社研究中心 跟成功大学制造了这个一个很美好的这个平台，给我们在学术界的同事们有机会去交流，有机会将我们所学到的一些研究成果呈现给你们。我本身是很出丑的，因为其实他讲的太好了，他的 introduction， 我没有这样厉害的，这其实我真的是真的很只有一个小小的一个 achievement 这样。然后呢我要跟你们道歉，因为今天呢我的讲座是会用英语，不过我已经知道每个人的英文是比我好的，所以我不用担心。All right, so maybe I will start by saying that I would like to thank the Center for Malaysian Chinese Studies and Cheng Kung University for inviting me to this wonderful conference and providing a platform for all of us scholars to share our views, our research with you. So thank you very much for that. And of course, I think, when I was invited to this particular conference and I was looking at this theme, right, which is actually the Chinese communities in the 21st century, retrospect and prospect for the new era. So in fact, a lot of my work, my recent works has been looking at the 21st century. So this is actually a very apt and timely theme because as the world changed and you know how complex the world has shifted from coupling to decoupling, from globalization to deglobalization, and everything that has happened, in the world today, how do we reposition ourselves? This is something that I think not only the Chinese, but everywhere, every other ethnic groups in the world are looking at. Because we are in the world, we are in this era of what I call hypermobility, right? Where we circulate, we moved around. Like what Mr. Chang said, I myself moved around. I mean, I was very surprised, during my era, there were so few of us who managed to actually go overseas to study. So I was also even more surprised that I was given a full scholarship to go and study, which is why I ended up at Monash to start with. And subsequently, when Stanford invited me there, they said, we only give you half a scholarship. So I said, oh no. Then I stayed at Monash. That was how I ended up getting a degree from Monash instead of Stanford. And of course, now in the 21st century, my daughter has been looking at me and saying, Mom, you're really stupid, The difference between Monash and Stanford is that Stanford is the Ivy League of the world, something like that. I kind of say, okay, you can go to the Ivy League. I am now stuck with Monash. But I think what I was trying to say is that circulation is very interesting. The opportunities, particularly during those years, during our time, was not easy to achieve, So getting out of Singapore wasn't very easy, let alone getting a scholarship to go somewhere and study, that kind of stuff. But of course, subsequently, I circulate around as well. And that, of course, impact on how I look at my own community, the Chinese community, and in fact of myself, of how I also define myself as an individual Chinese, right? And then what do we mean by Chinese or Chineseness, so on and so forth. So this is the background that I was sort of looking at myself. And then, so a bit of the history of why I actually ended up doing this particular research. And I've been doing this research for the last 30 years of my life. And the story is very interesting because when I first published my book on the rebuilding of Ancestral Village, right? Everyone congratulated me and said, oh, wow, finally you got your PhD dissertation published. And I kind of look at them and say, what? That's not my PhD dissertation. Okay, then they were all very surprised because most people, their first book would be based on their PhD dissertation. And mine was not. So I was telling them this very interesting story, which I would also like to share with you all. You see, this is one of the interesting things was, when you were doing graduate study, you're really excited, right? So you say, okay, this is what I want to do. And I told my supervisor, a wonderful idea, very good proposal, get on with it, right? Then as I was planning to go to China to do some research as well, okay, I need to get a visa. Remember, those were the days. So I went to the Chinese embassy at Melbourne, and the guy looked at me and said, "Oh, 你是新加坡人啊？哦，这样的话呢，你要回去新加坡，不是我们不要给你签证，是你们新加坡政府不要给你签证的哈。你要先去申请新加坡签证。So I make a trip back to Singapore, and the immigration in Singapore look at me and say, Miss Kwa, you're Singaporean, why are you coming here? Your visa to China has nothing to do with us. And then I said, send me back to the embassy in Singapore. So I went to it's also from Melbourne and Chinese embassy to Singapore Chinese embassy. And that guy looked at me and say, 柯小姐，你为什么不先跟你们的新加坡政府拿了那种允许证才来找我？然后呢，我就说哈，这个推那个推，然后我是去找谁？You know, then basically to cut the story short, it's essentially I have no avenue to go to visa, to get a proper student visa, a research visa to come to China. Then I went back to my university, and my supervisor was looking at me and saying, no visa, no go. Very simple. Then I said, I'm a Chinese. Chinese face can just slip in, all right? Those were the days where Moshe, the American guy, okay, student, who also was from Stanford, was doing some research in China and got booted out because he was writing on female infanticide. So, which was actually, at that time, was very sensitive, right? So, that is why my PhD research wasn't on this topic. But after my PhD, I actually worked on this. So it's a bit later. But of course, I published it earlier, faster than my PhD dissertation that came a bit later. So that was the history. So I shouldn't talk too much because then I will run into time shortage. And so let me start with this particular topic that I want to work on, which I'm very passionate about, and which I also published as a book as well. So this is the topic that I'm working on, that I will be speaking to you on, and I'm trying to advance this particular framework called the collaborative culture basin model. So let me sort of just give you a little bit background, right, of how this book come into play. And in fact, it is actually a long gestation period after I have written my first book, all right? And it's sort of basically, and basically it's sort of like kind of get me really interested, and that I decided finally that I need to write this book out, mainly because a lot of my colleagues were telling me that, hey, your book has been very well utilized globally. I say, okay, I have no idea, who reads my book, all right? So my colleagues at Harvard, and they all prescribe it as reading material as well. And of course, in mainland China, subsequently when I was there, they were telling me that almost all universities actually, people who works on Huaqiao Huaren will actually be using my book. So this is the first edition that was like in 2000, all right? So that was a long time ago. Then subsequently, Hong Kong U decided that they would publish it as well. So the second edition was actually published by Hong Kong U along with NUS Press and along with Amsterdam U Press. So there was a lot of publishers that were actually interested because they were saying that the European were also wanting to read about it. And of course, it's much easier to buy books from the area. So they decided to do all this kind of co-publication. And then of course, I have actually the Chinese version as well. So that was quite interesting. And the mainland Chinese people were really upset because they were actually reading a lot of English. Then subsequently, they discovered that there was a Chinese version. They say, 现在我们读得很轻松, something like that. And then just 2 years ago, Routledge decided that, well, we better bring out another version, edition of it. So the Routledge Revival edition was brought out as well. So that actually got me to think, because actually by then I was already working on this new book, right? And then I thought, I better hurry up, all right, to try to actually connect all the dots together. So this is the book that I have that was published last year, and I thought that as anthropologists, and I myself is an anthropologist, and I was looking at it. In anthropological research, we do a lot of empirical case studies. But for myself, because I'm also a sociologist, and I'm actually interested in theories, because for me, telling a beautiful story is one part, right? But the other part is to actually try to make sense of it, a much broader picture, to help people to understand, position, and connect themselves. So this is why I think theories, concepts are very important, right? And I'm really very excited when people actually start talking about concepts, and how, we can actually apply it to different situations. So that get me start thinking. When I started writing this particular book, I was actually looking at all the connecting points and what can actually brings everything together. And also, essentially, all my life works, because I've done 30 years of research. I've published numerously, sometimes as case studies, as individual papers, edited books, so on and so forth, right? But what to bring them together? So this is something that I'm very passionate about. And so let's start with this is a preliminary introduction. So this, you can read the book. I don't think you should read a book, just the introduction, all right, of what I've written in the book. So this is roughly what it is, right? So let me just go to the lecture proper. So about the presentation outline, okay. So I divide this into two sections. One would be, I'll talk first about the collaborative cultural framework, and then I zoom into the ancestor worship, right? So ancestor worship is through ancestor worship that we try to understand the dynamics of what Chinese culture is. And I think that in the 21st century, and this is why I'm very excited about this conference theme of the 21st century, is precisely because, you see, in the earlier years, the last decade, the last 2 decades, a lot of the scholars have been looking at the economic dimension. All right, 华人社会经济, that kind of stuff that we were talking about, right? But I think in the 21st century, and mark my word, I'm never wrong in this prediction, is that culture is going to play a much, much stronger role. And which is why you are looking at not only mainland Chinese, from mainland China to Europe to America and down to Asia, Southeast Asia, we are now talking about culture as soft power and culture as cultural diplomacy. I've written a little bit of that, and I'm still continuing around that, but this is what is going to be. The big framework is culture. Because when we talk about culture, we are also talking about economic networks, political networks, so on and so forth. All right. So why culture is so important? So this is my outline. And then, so let's start with the collaborative culture basin. I think it is a very fun way of doing it. Let me start by start with this particular term, the diaspora, as a conceptual category. Why do I start with this? Is because I remember 20 years ago when I first started using the term Chinese diaspora. I was caught in by Professor Wang Gungwu. Most of you all know. Wang Gungwu 教授就叫我进去说 Kun Eng, I disagree with what you wrote. I disagree with the concept that you used. 然后我就跟他讲 What? Why? What? So this particular concept is very controversial. All right. But actually, 10 years ago, 15 years ago, he actually told me, I think you're spot on, which is why in the scholarship world today, everyone is using the term diaspora. So it's, I started with Chinese diaspora. Suddenly you will have Indian diaspora and everybody, all the Middle Eastern diaspora, everybody started using this particular term. But what I really wanted to say also is this: why is this particular term sort of very sensitive or not very, happily used by some scholar? It was because there was a very small piece of article, like about 2-page something, that was written on how they define diaspora in the very early days. And it was used to describe the Jews, because the Jews were stateless prior to World War II, prior to where they carve out, the Israel state in the Middle East. So they were describing this, 游荡人民嘛，对吗? So then this 游荡人民 become 散居人民, all right? But which is the whole Chinese term also wrong, because 你是游荡，而且不是散, you get me? Whereas, so I also don't like to use the term 散居, all right? Sojourners maybe, but this was one early, one part of the very, very early history of migration. So actually we're talking about the migration thing as well. So that was one of the issues. Then, of course, when we start using, and which is why I think why I choose to use Chinese diaspora as to the other kind of terms that were used to describe the Chinese that were actually moving around, settling in other parts of the world. It's because, in the early days, we all know that, and, for all of you, of us who read Chinese literature, the early Chinese history, all the mainland Chinese scholars, even the mainland Chinese government, were talking about Huaqiao, right? I have problem with Huaqiao, the category itself, because conceptually it's a bit problematic. All right. And also subsequently, in 1992, when Wang Gongwu, Wang Lingzi, the whole lot of earlier scholars, they started looking at how do we redefine Chinese outside China. Okay. Which is why ISCO was formed. The International Society for the Study of Chinese Overseas was formed in 1992 when Wang Gong was the vice chancellor at HKU then, right? So what actually happened at that time was that, they started saying that instead of using overseas Chinese, overseas Chinese, right, we would use Chinese overseas. So, but this term, but 海外华人 is also very problematic, because within the discourse itself, right, you are actually then placing yourself next to the big brother mainland China, all right? So the implication within the scholarly world is the core and periphery, and it started off with Immanuel Wallenstein's work on the core and periphery in terms of the economic dimensions, the dynamics at that time of the world. So I don't like this term, because I think the Chinese, you and I here, all of us are here, I think we are not in the periphery, right? 我们不是在边缘的, all right? So 这核心跟边缘的那个, 这两个词语, it's a more like comparative kind of dimension, right? And when I'm comparing you with me, I'm pitting you against me, that kind of stuff. So I don't like this particular term, honestly. So which is why I use the term diaspora for a whole variety of reasons. And it's also very important when we are talking about that. It's because, you see, in using the term Chinese diaspora or diaspora Chinese, global diaspora Chinese. Now, this is another big area that we need to start thinking about, because the nation state comes into play. How do you want to define yourself? Do you define yourself? I mean, I often, when people ask me, the best part is, 你是中国人吗？你是不是中国人？ Then I look at them, I say, 我是华人。 So this is something that they don't like it if you're in mainland China, right? Because they keep wanting me to use the term 中国人. I always use this term, 新加坡华人. All right. And they got even more angry. Okay. When I was in Jinan Daxue, that's exactly, I have a professor, every time I go back to China, he, without fail, will be asking me the same question. So I was there for 5 years, and I go there like, in my obligations, I have to be there 3 months a year. And that 3 months, you can just go there like 2 weeks or 3 weeks each time. So 每次我进到那边，他就会问同样的一个问题的。老师，你是华人你是中国人吗？那个谁，我是新加坡华人。He always look at me, you know, without feel like, 你到底是谁？你知道吗？ Okay, so this is something. And so this whole idea about the Chinese diaspora, all right, where you put Chinese first, this is so the way I know in diaspora 是说你就是不是在中国的哈 and not within China, but where are you within it, right? So do you want to use Chinese diaspora, Chinese first, ethnicity first, then nation state, or nation state first, then ethnicity? Now this is something that, you know, scholars are debating about. There is no hard and fast rule, right? I write on Chinese diaspora, but in this new book, I actually turn it around and say diaspora Chinese, precisely because I think nation state comes first, and then ethnicity comes second. Okay, so this is how I look at it, and of course, because this whole idea for me, it addresses the issue of the idea of migration. Because now we're not talking about unilateral migration; we're talking about multilateral kind of migration. And for me, in one of my work that I've written is like, when you move from destination A to destination B, it's only one stop, because you never know you're going to circulate to another stop, right? So migration is never the end point now. So that I think is also very important, because a lot of scholars in the earlier days, when they write about migration, they're actually talking about from point 1 to point 2, you know, 从汕头、厦门, then you go to Singapore, that is the end migration in the early days. But in today's hypermobility world, you know, mobile world, we are not talking about that. We're talking about points, all right, from one point to the next point. So it is what I call the circulatory migration that becomes a lot more important, more exciting. You know, I look at myself, for a long time, I thought that I would never be going back to Singapore, right? Because I've traveled so much. And then, I'm now back in Singapore. But this is also another point, because at some point, I might go off somewhere else. My daughter's never going. I mean, well, I wouldn't say never, but at the moment, she's telling me, "Oh, Mom, you know, she's working in London and New York. So she said, maybe you can come and join me there." You know, that kind of stuff, right? So this is very interesting to also look at. But at the same time, I think it's also very important that we acknowledge, right, the existence of an ancestral home. So 我是讲是祖家、祖乡, you know. So it is not homeland in that sense. You know, so in English, we are very specific about, you know, what kind of terms we want to use to represent ourselves. So this is a kind of representation. Why you 多少时间啊? Well, tell me, because I haven't really started it yet, right? So I only have 20 minutes. Give me another 30 minutes to do, all right? And I'll finish it up very fast. It's very important, because as we define, all right, what do we mean? So I have a lot of chart to tell you. So I have been looking at ourselves, all right? And a lot of all you people are not from mainland China. So you want to position yourself, are you within the diaspora, even including Taiwan? You know, I have to be very careful about treating Taiwan cases as well, all right? And I'll explain. That's why in my book, a bit more huda. You know, but what I'm trying to say is that, you see, how do I put people in the diaspora category? So you look at it, there is always a nation-state boundary. So you can see this 框架, the red one, all right? And within the nation-state boundary, there are variations. And I think Richard Xi Rongchong yesterday was talking about the variations. You know, there are so many different groups of them. You're talking about, you know, I divide them into like 2 groups, basically, right? Maybe there are more that you can tell me, all right? The rooted Chinese community, the recent migrant community, it can be transient, the new migrant that we're talking about. Then here, in the rooted Chinese community, the local one that we're talking about, you have different generations, all right? first 1.5, 2, 3, 4, 5, so there's a lot of them. Then here you have the spouses, the children, and some of them, if they join here, some of them have already gone into this rooted one, if they are there for a bit longer. So you have to look at the time frame as well. So space and time is very important in this case, all right? And they could be in this category or in this category, okay, the recent transient. And then of course, then there is a transient group. There are the expatriates, the migrant workers, the students. All right, a lot of cases, people talk about this part of the big migration thing, but then how do you then recategorize them, right? So what are the characteristics, which is actually very important. And so I actually have outlined here, right? So one of the key factors is that there is the identification, all right, of the nation state boundary, because they have to claim that they are part of that nation state. So that sense of belonging is there, and you have to make that decision, all right, that you are part of that nation state first. I mean, of course, there is a lot of debate about I can be part of that community, but not part of that nation state. So these are a lot of debates that we won't go into today, all right? So that's one thing. So that sense of belonging, that whole idea about ethnicity, that how you self-identify yourself is important. And then I look at it, is that, there are the two sets of cultural values, and this is where you can decide for yourself, right? You uphold certain aspects of Chinese cultural practices. I mean, we like to use a cliche, we all uphold Confucian values, but actually, a lot of us educated overseas, educated in our part of the world, we are also been exposed to social libertarian values, so on and so forth. So these are the different kinds of value system, thought processes that we are looking at, all right? So that's one thing. And this is very important because, when you're talking about Western liberal ideology, where ideas of democracy, freedom of speech, equality of rights and other social values, they're all intermixed together, and that becomes part of our everyday life experience. So that becomes very important, right? It is not about a set of values that I tell you is here, but it is not. It is how you internalize it and how you operationalize it as an individual within yourself and within your community. That becomes very important. So that is why, you see, at the end of the day, you tend to then try to describe yourself. I mean, in the American world, I mean, they will be telling me I'm a ABC, I'm a BBC, whatever C you have, right? So for a lot of you here, you could be MBC, right? British, Malaysian born or something like that. So these are the final definition, right? Categorization that we all make of ourselves. Okay, then of course, that is part of it. So for that, I like our Taiwan 同事 here to think about it. Whether do you fit into the diaspora category or you fit into somewhere else? It's something that I better not define for you because I get into big trouble as well. Okay. Then of course the Chinese universe, the mainland Chinese universe. Here we have even more complex. And if you ever go to mainland China, you find that there is of course very direct PRC citizen. But then they have a lot of 少数民族 also, right? That also want to redefine themselves. Then I have a category called PRC sovereign subjects. And these are the post-colonial subjects. So Chinese born in Hong Kong and Macau. They are now part of mainland China, but they actually don't feel that they are part of mainland China. You get what I mean? Which is why they also start moving around. So there is a lot of that kind of migrational trend that we're talking about. Then this other category, which is also very interesting, is overseas Chinese, all right, living in Huaqiao Nongchang. And this is another very, very big, interesting category. I visited some of the Nongchang, right? And they are very sad, all right? I mean, a lot of them came from there's a few from Malaysia as well, and Indonesian, the leftover, throw over. And they never really fit into the mainland Chinese scene. And the best part was mainland Chinese government has this policy of of course their descendants have moved out of the Nongchang, but they still have that status as Huaqiao Nongchang, the Hua Yi. right? So it's a very complex situation that we are also looking at. And of course, today we are talking about mainland Chinese coming back with mainland talent, right? Those who lived overseas for many years, they come back. And so you have many now with foreign nationality. So this is a very big framework that we are looking at. And this is why I thought it's quite interesting to sort of spell that out for you all. So then, apart from that, what we are also actually looking at is this whole idea about, the kind of mobility pattern, right? If you actually look at the two groups of them, there are a lot of intersection. So you have a variety of them. So within the diaspora, you have the rooted diaspora Chinese, the varieties of global diaspora Chinese. That is to say that, you have all the diaspora groups from different parts of the world in your country as well, right? So that variation has always been there, but it's more pronounced in today's 21st century. And then very, I guess, no surprising, it's a lot of mainland Chinese in the diaspora as well. And you also see actually a variant of it within mainland China. You have the mainland Chinese, you have the returnees, seagull, sea turtle, so on and so forth. 他们有海鸥、海龟一大堆，然后在这边。然后 then there's also the whole variety. Then the whole variety of 像我们这些去那边工作的那些哈。So there is that parallel that we are actually talking about. So what are we looking at, all right, is actually the creation within all these segments, right, within this big framework. We are also talking about the creations of the different sets of social relationships, social networks, all right. There are a lot of them, some of them crisscross. So it is, and which is why you see these are the Venn diagram. So there are some connections among them, but not that much. And which is one of the very big issue when we do migration studies as well, is that, 他们各自在自己的圈子里啊，so how do you integrate them into the wider society? It's a very big problem. And all countries are still wrestling with it. So there is a level of trust, but there is a big level of tensions and rivalry. And today it's played out because when the economy becomes affected, that's where all hell broke loose, all right? So that is something that we are looking at. And so finally, we go to this collaborative culture basin framework. So what I'm trying to propose is that if you're looking at all these varieties of Chinese and like Rong Chong was talking about, identity, and then yesterday Ming Feng was talking about, identity, continuity, and all those things that we are looking at, right? How do you then position all these different groups of people? What are they doing? How do they do it, right? Because everyone is a Chinese. Mainland Chinese government narratives that 我们全部是天下一家人的那种, you get me? So you must acknowledge me, the big brother, right? But a lot of these people like us say, no, you're not my big brother, 我们是各自家户这样啊, something like that. So there's that complication. And when I look at it in terms of the culture, so what I really want to sort of share with you is that the way I look at it is that a collaborative culture basin is defined as a shared social cultural space where the interflow and intersection of cultural ideas and elements occur within, between, and among of these different social groups. So we're not talking about the didactic relationship between mainland China and the diaspora communities. It's also within the diaspora community. So you're talking about Malaysian Chinese and Singaporean Chinese. All right. We often say that, Malaysian Chinese is a little bit different from us Singaporean Chinese, right? Agree? Agree. See, I see a lot of nodding head because this is exactly what my Malaysian colleagues tell me. 我们跟你不一样的，你知道吗？ Then I say, 哈？怎么不一样？哇，你们这些 you know, your work, you don't know how to enjoy life. 其实我在国际场合上，很多人都跟我讲，新加坡人是不会享受生活的。然后我们看到香港人呢，我們也是跟香港人講，哇，你哋咧真係做到冇命咁噶啦，就是做到沒命這樣的，真的不會享受生活。我去美國的時候 ，they look at me， 可能 let's go and enjoy life at the coffee， 我們就喝咖啡。Okay, so there's these things that we're talking about, the flow of ideas, there's a share of ideas, but there's also differences, all right? So what I'm trying to say is that when we look at the collaborative culture base, it is a multi-layer and multi-modality space, all right? So in that sense, what I'm also thinking of is actually you're looking at space, time, you know, temporal, geographic space, is one aspect. But of course, in recent day, in the 21st century, don't forget, the internet is very important. The digital space, the third space that we're talking about, right, is there. And then on top of that, it's packed against a lot of other variation. The youth, right? So age, all these intergenerational, all comes in. Gender, you know, so that variation is all there that you have to start thinking about, all right? So it's multi-layered, multi-modal. And then, of course, and this is very important, and I have to tell you this, I presented it in Mainland China, they finally agree with me, this particular point, that within the collaborative culture space, you know, the different groups of Chinese are co-equals, co-creators and co-consumers of a shared Chinese culture. So that is to say that, you know, 以前呢，他们会讲的，哦，这个是我们中华文化是5000年的，对吗？然后他就会问你，哪一个版本是比较正宗的？ And I always tell them, in anthropology, there's no such thing as cultural authenticity. Because culture change. Culture is not static, it's dynamic, it changes so much, right? That you are actually living with an evolving culture. And that culture in itself is very important for every one of us because we embrace it, all right? It is part of our existence, it's part of our identity. So that is something, 5 minutes only. Okay, I only just started, you know, all right? So that is very important to look at this particular aspect, co-creators, right? And then at the same time, I mean, no doubt there are contestation, there's rivalry among different groups because they want to lay claim, right? To what is shared culture, what is the authentic culture that we're looking at. But for me, we have to go beyond that. You know, yeah, we can understand the origin of something, but also we want to look at it in terms of cultural hybridization as well. That in fact, all cultures evolve and we are part of the creators of that culture. The very minute that I talk to you, you talk to me about all these different things, we reshape it. So that reshaping is a very real thing in modernity and that we need to recognize it, all right? So in a way, you know, we are also looking at this kind of hypermobility and intense interaction, right? Of these different groups of people, of this particular ethnicity, right? You know, so in our case, it's a Chinese one. So as such, the collaborative culture base is a socio-cultural heritage and memory space. So it is your memory. Remember that. It is not other people's memory. It's yours memory, your group's social memory that becomes very important. That informs your identity, right? And it also encourages cross-pollination. All right, it's very important. Because when you live in this part of the world, Malaysia, Singapore, right? What happened is that we are in constant contact with other ethnicity. We also borrow their cultural elements into it. So, you know, in Singapore, we speak Singlish. You understand Singlish? 我听不懂的，你知道吗？我回去的时候，人家跟我讲 ，OK, I will tell you. 我有一个同事，他就跟我讲，可能you see me no up. OK, 可能you see me no up. You got me? You see me no up. 你看不起我。 a long time to actually understand see me no up is what. And 你知道哦，他们曾主任就大笑了一大场，然后他就跟我讲 ，Kuning, you're no longer Singaporean。我给他气死，我说怎么会变成我是不是新加坡人？因为我不懂得 English， 你知道吗？你说我从小我在 Australia 念书就跑出去了，所以 English 我真的是很少接触到。然后我的新加坡的圈子里的那一班呢，全部都跟我讲很好的 English。So they see me no up and then I was like, it took me a while to sing in. Literally, I have to think. And then by then, everyone already have their good laugh already, all right? It make me look like an idiot. Okay, so this is what I mean. Hybridization is very important, all right? How we express it. And of course, it's also a place, a space where cultural conversion, cultural fusion, cultural separation occurred. So you actually see it a lot. And how they navigate this cultural landscape becomes very important. So within it, there are feelings, emotions, and sentiment infused material culture. All right, cultural practices, performance. So all these are part of our everyday life. Okay, let's better go and try to finish this slide. So therefore, when we talk about collaborative culture basin, it's essentially like that. You are looking at, and 这边呢，其实我可以放多几个框的 quite a few one because there is a lot of varieties of people. But just for simplicity's sake, we look at two groups, right? And the Venn diagram, the middle part with all the red crosses here, right? This is the collaborative. These are the shared cultural elements, right? That 我们认同. That means the different groups of people actually identify with, all right? But at the same time, we also would identify with our own variety, our variation. And I think this is the only way to go, because otherwise it will be too complex, too much of a fight among people, all right? Because if you are starting to tell me that I'm not a Chinese because I don't behave like a Malaysian, I'll be very upset, correct? And you'll be very upset if I say the same thing as you. It's like my Taiwan friend laugh at me and I say, 哎呀，你的中文讲得很差的。我就教中文讲就真的很差。But the important thing is that 你知道我在讲些什么嘛，对吗？ So that is what we talk about it, and which is why language in itself becomes communicative, and that in itself is very important. All right. So let's not go too fast into it. So let me go part 2. Now I have only 5 more minutes, is it? 5 more minutes to finish it. Maybe I just show you some picture. Now, that was very, very interesting because I thought I will give you one of the examples, because for a lot of our scholars here, our colleagues here, I mean, we all work on the cultural dimension as well. And that cultural dimension, you don't have to do ancestor worship. You can do something food or popular culture, right? Within that particular framework that I have just advocated, okay? And so for me, I use this as a very interesting example, right? Because it's kind of a bit of follow-up from my first book as well. Is that, when we look at ancestors and how the Chinese look at ancestors is very, very interesting. In my own research, what I've discovered, and particularly after the open door policy in 1978, and even today, because when I go to different parts of Guangdong provinces, there's a lot of revival of 启同、祠堂、左储、主处, so there's a lot of rebuilding of them, all right? And part of the reason is because mainland Chinese government, of the local government supported it. And because in my earlier book, I talk about the establishment of a moral economy. So which is to say that they use ancestor worship as a kind of soft power, or what I call the cultural power, all right, to actually bring the people back, to help them with village redevelopment, so on and so forth, all right. And of course, why do the diaspora Chinese go back? It's because they also want to visit, and particularly the first generation. All right. And now we're looking at the second and third generation. And this is also very interesting because there's a lot of variation now going on there. Okay, so wouldn't talk more about that. But what is important is that when we look at this, what we found, can you see I think where's the red space here? Okay, look at that part. If you notice that there's a parallel universes. So we are looking at the diaspora Chinese. So for a long time, and even today, you have this particular group of people who actually perform ancestor worship in your own country, in your own, like in Singapore, so on and so forth. And then the mainland Chinese are also doing it, that same thing. So what you're talking about is that there is this shared space that we're all looking at. And at some point, you find that the diaspora Chinese wants to go back. And there's a very small group of them. Not everyone would want to go back, because I also know people who are very antagonistic, all right? So you find that there is this whole idea about, I call it the split ancestral soul. So in my own research, I'm discovering, and yesterday I was talking to somebody about, they might bring a bit of the ashes back to the Chaoxiang kind of stuff, right? And this will result in this establishment of this lineage ancestral home. So for me, when we talk about migration, we talk about shared collaborative, culture basic. This is one aspect of how they look at Jizu. How they look at ancestor worship, how they look at ancestors. And actually, the question that we are actually asking is that, is ancestor still important in the 21st century Chinese community? All right. So in modernity, how do we restructure this kind of relationship? So for my own case study, one aspect which I thought was very interesting is that this idea about territorialization, deterritorialization occurred also among the ancestors, all right? So what you have is the first generation, right? The very, very early ancestors. What they did was they left the ancestral village, they become sojourner, they ultimately become rooted Chinese diaspora, right? And then as they go through their life cycle in, say, a different environment from their home village in China, they start thinking about, they are settled in that particular part of the world. I got 2 minutes. And then after that, what happened then is, as they are growing much older, they are thinking of back their own homeland as well. So this is where, we are then looking at that circulation, all right, of that ancestor, the ancestor, So we talk about deterritorialization and reterritorialization, and of course multi-territorialization, because we find that it's very interesting that the ancestor, where do you place ancestor soul becomes the tablet becomes important. So in Singapore, what you find that there are some, they have one here in Singapore, one in China, and then maybe if they are children, one of their children is in America, they also have one there. So it's actually a very interesting way of, and this is why I talk about the centrality of ancestor and ancestor worship in Chinese society. All right, that at some point when you're young, you don't care. Jizu is not important to me when I was 20 years old. Who cares, right? But as you grow older, then you start looking at how it moves, because it makes you think of your own personal identity as well, and where you want to reposition yourself. So this is how I look at it in terms of, where you ultimately have these ancestral souls dual home or even multiple home. All right. In my own research, I was only looking at this, but then subsequently, after I finished my book, a lot of people are telling me that, oh, we also put one in America, in Chicago or something like that, right? So there's quite a few of these that went off. And so how then we define the ancestral spiritual homes, right? So I look at it in terms of, actually, they have so many different homes. Where you look at here in mainland China, and then in mainland China also they have different homes. So that's also very interesting to look at. First, there's the domestic altar, because if you actually have a jia to go back to, right? So here comes. You might have one altar, then, but of course, everybody wants to go into the 祠堂, all right, or the 桌处. And when the 桌处is filled up already, you know, persona non grata because it's full, then you create your own sub-lineage ancestral home. So that's how you see actually a cluster of ancestral 祠堂 and 桌处 all clustered together. So there is also another very interesting phenomenon when you go to mainland China to have a look. All right. Now, I'm finishing in a few more slides. So then, how do we look at the ancestral home? And this is also something that in my own research, I thought it's very interesting to look at it in terms of serving it as a socio-communal space. Because to be honest, like what Mr. Chang said, that when we're actually looking at our of how we connect to one another, where we are, who we as an individual, I think the same things goes here. The ancestral home actually position itself more as a place of a socio-communal space where you interact with other groups of Chinese as well. So we're not talking about only the mainland Chinese goes there, not only the Singaporean, but there's also American, the people from Southeast Asia, because the migration pattern is such that people go to different parts of the world. Their descendants go to other parts of the world as well. So there is a multimodal space as well that we are talking about. It's also an emotional space that even when I talk to the second, third generation, it's also very interesting. I mean, the kind of emotions is different from the first generation emotion. So actually, there is a whole pool of literature on emotions. So for those who are interested, you can read on some of those books as well. And that tells us a lot about how how individual positions themselves, right? I'm trying to uncover their own existentialism. All right. And then a gender empowered space. It's very, very interesting. We know that Chinese is still very patriarchal. You look at the Zuhu, it's only the male line, that kind of stuff. But in modernity, women plays a very important role, and how they challenge that particular role is also important. So I look at that as this. It's a socio-moral space as well. All right. You can actually redefine what morality is, but what values that can be put into it. An expressive and negotiated space. It is expression of everything that we talk about. And importantly, it is a socio-ritual conavia, right? That is to say that it is actually where all the ritual performances take place. And it is through that ritual performances that you come and identify yourself. Whether you identify or don't identify, it doesn't matter. Because I also know of people, the younger generation, who went there, had fun, all right? And they say, oh, I really don't care about all these things, okay? So there are things like this that actually happen. Do you want to see picture? Okay, just quickly, 3 more minutes. I mean, this is, it's taken quite a long time ago, but I also have the updated picture, but I didn't show you. I thought it was very nice to look at it from a bit earlier on, right? Where you actually see that this is a typical Zhuochu, right? Where in Fujian, Anxi area. And then there's a lot of rituals. I think in Malaysia, you also have some kind of elaborate rituals. It's like 4 or 5 days, Every day I have to wake up at 3 o'clock, all right? And then at night, 12 o'clock, because the performance is literally that intensive, right? You go fetch the sacred water. It's very interesting to look at as an anthropologist, right? The kind of micro details. And then villages as social witnesses. In China, in Singapore, I'm sure in Malaysia, you do things, but you want to be noticed. People must take notice of you. And they will verify that, yes, you have done this. So social witnessing is very important. So you find that, and because I want to show you the older picture is because this was captured after the open door policy. Because prior to that, you would never see monks doing all these things, right? It is not acceptable. But because of the open door policy, and now it's a lot easier to do this, all right? And during that time, it's a lot more restricted. You've got to get permission, and then the local government has to be involved. So there's a lot of complications going on there. And then you can see, and then it's quite interesting because as we're talking about how we co-create cultures, right? One thing that you really discovered is that when it comes to religion, that creation of culture is always back to the old style, right? I mean, so even today, you will see people trying to dress up in the traditional style as well. And this is very important part of the ritual. And I think in Malaysia, you all do that, fen zu rou, because with that little piece of meat, you can claim that you are part of that particular entity. And along with that will be a lot of privileges. So the student can get scholarships to go overseas to study. So this is very important, all right? 一小块的猪肉是很重要的，你知道吗？没有猪肉的话，你不可以讲说你是这边的人。But of course, they wouldn't give you the 猪肉also, right? If you're not that particular lineage group. These are the very happy young. I met them like a year ago. They're all adults and very rich in Xiamen, living in penthouses. They were very poor there. All right. So you actually do see that how the interactions between the diaspora Chinese and the mainland Chinese actually create avenues for some of them to actually get out of the village setting to become who they are today as well. So 这些都是你们看过的了哈。So very quickly, and then there's a lot of them. So these are the kind of communal gathering that we talk about. Okay, the important part is how we look at lineage ancestral house as a social ritual conhabia, right? And here I was looking at it in terms of, the immigrant village, the home village, right? You have the group of diaspora members, and then you have the lineage in the immigrant village, and this one in the urban center. So now, I mean, in the early days, there is only this group and this group, all right? But today you have this added group. So what I'm also trying to say is that apart from the diaspora, you also have a lot of them who are 新移民. They have managed to move out already. And a lot of them also move to the main city areas. And it is where that they actually get, all the resources. And some of them, particularly, this group, they actually pump a lot of money back home. This group less now, today less so, because they don't need our money anymore, okay? So this is how I look at it. But having talked about no money, just recently, I received a phone call from someone in a scholar who basically tells me, oh, she's also doing the research in my area, and she's in touch with the village, that county that I do my research on. 柯老师，你可以叫那些海外的同胞人帮我们吗？ I say, huh? 帮什么？ Because the economy is so bad. They basically say, we don't need you all to donate money to build houses, village, hospitals anymore. Can you ask them to donate cash? I say, huh? 因为你知道现在的经济是很差，所以其实他们呢在县里连小学老师的工资都付不起。So they actually need cash. And I have to tell them I'm so sorry because all the oldies have all passed on. The youngies are not so interested. So there is a lot of tensions, that when we talk about the collaborative culture basing, one thing that I also didn't put, I put emotions and everything in, right? But it is, to what extent do you stretch that obligation? So there's the other aspect of obligation that we need to look at. I got one more slide, I think. So how do we look at ancestor worship? All right, ancestor and its worth in modernity, right? So I essentially look at it in terms of, you can start looking at it as a form of economic capital, social capital, socio-moral capital, and eventually it is also utilized as a form of cultural capital by the mainland Chinese state as well. All right, in mainland China, but in the diaspora community, it is also part of that big framework of cultural capital and cultural power that we're looking at. Okay, so this one, I think I will skip this, but it's another very interesting aspect of how they utilize ancestor to become a tourist capital as well. So let's just keep that. So in summary, right, what I've just repeated and just sort of refresh you is that, you know, when we look at collaborative culture basing framework, right, there are all these different shared elements on this part and the other part as well. And that dynamics will play itself out in different forms as well. All right. I mean, for my framework, it is a prototype. It is just an ideal type model. So I'm open to all your suggestions of, you know, how we can reshape this one. What are the variations that we can put inside, you know, this culture basing? All right. Thank you so much. Thank you for your attention.
我们非常感谢柯老师的这个精彩，非常精彩，还有这个非常启发性的这个演讲啊。当然作为主持人我没有办法，我只要给他这个 signal 哈时间。我相信大家也听了老师的这个分享过后呢，也是希望有很多的问题要跟老师交流哈。那么我们由于时间的关系呢，那我们只拿2个问题哈。来，有没有什么问题？来，老师您坐下。不要把这个机会交给我，我已经准备了2个问题，其实还有很多问题要问啊，但我相信还是留给大家。有没有问题？没有的话，那我先发问一个问题哈，老师，我其实对您刚才一开始这个讲这个，还有最后总结的时候有讲这个经济的这个实力会转向您预测嘛哈，就到这个社会文化的这种power，那基于现在目前的这种deglobalization， 还有这种 geopolitical 的 tensions 哈，会不会影响到这个整个的文化的这种交流？因为毕竟你说美国华人、马来西亚华人，他有这种区域政治的这种考量啊，他可能呢会有这种影响嘛。
OK，
那我们看到经济上已经有影响的哈。
其实一个很好的问题，其实我的看法就是这样的，就是因为有这经济的矛盾的存在，文化就更重要了，因为它是可以通过不同的文化阶段重新去整理这个经济的情况的。So in a way， 我们为什么会讲到说这是一种软实力，而且是一种文化外交，也就是说你不要将经济摆在前面嘛，对吗？所以你就通过一个比较间接的那种关系去就好像以前华人社会就说一直讲到关系这样一种，对吗？所以你一讲到关系，其实很多时候我们是不讲经济的，我们是讲其他东西的，我们去喝茅台酒，还是去喝高粱酒吧，对吧？所以再从那边就慢慢的进去。You get what I'm trying to say? So this is exactly how I look at it, and this is why I think in the 21st century modernity, right, culture would play a much more crucial role because it's not a direct slap on your face. So you will see how people negotiate. So it has now become quite a well-known economic business strategy. Do not talk business, you talk culture.
谢谢。来，哎呀，这位。
我有一个小问题啊，就是文化，它是祭祖文化，我不知道在台湾祭祖文化是有世代差异的。
Yes，
祭祖文化是我们这一代的事情，我的下一代他们没有接触到这个东西了。那不知道柯老师，您对于这个世代差异的祭祖文化过程当中，你有什么样的看法？谢谢。
对。I think it's a very good question. I mean, I also keep thinking about it, you know, how do intergenerational can you bridge the international intergenerational gap， 就是跨时代嘛，对吗？就是所以我觉得是这样的，在21世纪呢，我刚才 show 你那些照片呢，可能就会慢慢的被删掉了那种不过呢，你不要忘记，网络是一个很 powerful 的一个工具来的。所以我现在就看到呢，其实如果你现在你们现在开始 Google 你可以 Google 一个ancestor worship 的，它是有一个 ancestor worship 的一个 website， 就是说你可以在网上祭祖的，你知道吗？而且你不要你不需要自己祭祖，你可以给钱，人家帮你祭祖的对吗？其实我就说，就是以前是线下的，现在呢全部就搬到线上嘛，然后搬到线上的就我们就现在看 second generation、third generation 那一代。其实到了我这一代呢，我其实也是不大做的，就是我妈妈3年前的，她高龄了，她97岁就过世的时候，然后你知道我的大姐就每次呢我回到新加坡就说 I think you got to go and pray to mother， 就我就去拜一下嘛，对吗？现在我的女儿自己回来会跟我讲的I think maybe we should go and visit grandmother。这他们又不是说去拜，是去拜访。然后拜访就是去 temple 那边拜，So I think ancestor worship will not go away。就是说祭祖这个就是祖先跟祭祖呢是不会怎么讲遗失掉的。其实他会，而且他是会用不同的方式同样去祭祖，就好像我很多同事他们是 Christian 的话，他们就会说我们会 memorialize 它就是对吗？所以你 memorialize 就是你可以看着他的照片还是什么的，所以 it's a very different form of ancestor worship and this is something that I think is worth looking at。 因为现在你开始看到这些不同的做法，所以我很鼓励一些学生们，如果你们有兴趣做研究的话，可以考虑这个课题。Thank you, Richard。
好，谢谢老师的回复。那由于时间的关系，那我们就在此结束我们这一个第2场次的这个主题演讲。如果大家还有什么其他的问题的话，可以私底下跟老师交流。好，谢谢大家，再会。
谢谢大家，谢谢你们。然后我再借这个机会呢，我也要感谢我们的同学们背后的筹备者，你们辛苦了，谢谢你们的。
好，感谢柯教授的精彩演讲以及张主任的主持。我们稍稍在台前再合影一张好吗？对，在台前。